See who made a perfect score on the quiz today. Someone get 100% on our little trivia quiz. And I want to thank Brett for that song on creation. You know, today throughout the entire world field for the Seventh-day Adventist Church is Creation Sabbath. And if I had realized that ahead of time, I might have done a sermon on creation. But it's good to be with you today. I'm so excited to be here. And I've looked forward to this for some time, and after getting scheduled and rescheduled a number of different times, I knew they were going to invite me back because someone had said they were going to invite me back during the winter. Well, they didn't use the word winter. They just said they were going to invite me back to speak something about it being a real cold day, and they were going to invite me back. So glad to be with you today. Before we begin, let's just bow our heads and have a word of prayer. Father in heaven, as the rain's been falling gently outside, we ask you to send the Holy Spirit and the latter rain into our lives. Be with us today as we open your word and study. Give us the blessing that we've come for. And we ask these things in your name. Amen. Maybe you first heard the story of Zacchaeus as you were a little child in Sabbath school. I can remember singing the song, Zacchaeus was a wee little man was he. Climbed up into the sycamore tree for the Jesus he wanted to see. And we'd sing that song with all the motions, and we remembered that song about Zacchaeus. Well, the setting today in the sermon is Jericho, AD 31. It's the week before Passover. Jericho is a Palestinian city there in the West Bank, and it's in the Jordan Valley. It has a population of about 20,000 people today. Not much really happens in the city of Jericho. In fact, in the 1400 years before that, not much has really happened. You remember that the children of Israel were to surround the city, play their trumpets, go around one time, and then on the seventh day, they played their trumpets and marched around the city 7 times, and the walls fell down. Quite a story. Rahab, who was the harlot there, the prostitute, she put that red scarlet line out of the window, and then all of her family were spared at that time. So it's the week before Passover. The word had gone out that Jesus was going to be coming through the city. And there was a huge crowd that was gathering. Now it's evident that Jesus' reputation had preceded him because he had the reputation of performing miracles. He had the reputation of being the promised Messiah. He was the long-awaited prophet and much reported, a controversial teacher, and yet these people had gathered to see Jesus. He was a celebrity. It brought people out of all walks of life, and many were there out of curiosity just to see Jesus. They'd heard so much about him. Some people came that day, and they were in the crowd because of the disdain that they had for the master. And some were there, like the lame, the blind, the feeble. They were there for healing. But there were some there because they had a spiritual need in their lives. And they were needing to have someone help them to be able to get over this spiritual unrest. Sometimes the chaplains and sometimes theologians, they say there was a disruption of spiritual trust in their life. They were suffering from spiritual distress. And in that group of people who were suffering from spiritual distress that day was a man by the name of Zacchaeus. Now the Bible tells us about Zacchaeus, and it says that he was a tax collector. Oddly enough, his name meant pure. I don't know why they named him pure, but that's what he was named as a child. And you know that already how the people in Israel hated and despised tax collectors. It was an entirely different emotion from what we think of the IRS today. They hated the tax collectors. They did a survey some time ago about which professions were the most respected and which ones were the least respected. At the very top of the respected professions were doctors and nurses and clergy. At the very bottom, with about a 12% rating were the IRS and attorneys. Well, it reminds me of the story of a fellow who was getting on the elevator one day. And he was saying to his partner, he says, as they were in the elevator and the doors closed, he said, this COVID's been devastating for a lot of people. But he said, I have to tell you, he said, this has been the best year I've ever had. And he said, it's been an exciting year. And he said, I just am so excited to see what happens with the rest of this year. And as he was talking, he looked over in the elevator, and there was the IRS auditor. And the words had just come out of his mouth, how it was the best year he ever had. And so he said, of course, spiritually speaking, that is. Well, things had been not going well for Zacchaeus. They hadn't been going well monetarily, but they hadn't been going well spiritually. You see, the tax collectors worked for Rome. The Roman Empire stretched across the then known world, and there was actually several hundred different nationalities and groups and languages, and they decided that under this hand of Rome, Rome would hire local citizens to do their dirty work for them. They didn't send Romans in to take and collect the taxes. They would hire local citizens to do the taxes for them, and actually people who wanted to make some money and do pretty well, they could do very well working for Rome and collecting all of the taxes. Now, 5 miles to the east of Jericho, there was one of the 3 important entry points. In fact, it was the only point between the Sea of Galilee and the Dead Sea. And so Zacchaeus would set up at this key entry point where he would collect the taxes from everyone. And people couldn't avoid it. There wasn't any other way to go. And so from these diverse and resentful people, it was necessary to extract the taxes. And so their citizens were being used to do Rome's dirty work. Now, they had 2 different types of taxes. They had a poll tax. They had a property tax, a land tax. And these 2 taxes, we're told, had caused many, many revolts among the children of Israel. And other people had revolted too at the high taxes. And sometimes you just had to pay whatever they said that you owed, even though it wasn't right, you had to pay it. So these citizens became very wealthy doing Rome's dirty work. However, it was done at the expense of their reputation because they were despised by their own people. If you were a tax collector, you were looked upon as the lowest of the low. And so there was a shame that was attached to being a tax collector. Jewish people were very proud, nationalistic people. Remember the story of Daniel, how he would go to the lion's den before he would pray to another god. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they'd be thrown into the fire furnace before they would pray to the king because they were proud, nationalistic people and they wanted to pray to their God. They didn't want anyone to tell them that they had to pray to an alien emperor. And so when Zacchaeus chose this line of work, he in effect was turning his back on his own people and he was turning his back on God because Zacchaeus was a tax collector, but he wasn't just an ordinary tax collector. The Bible tells us he was the chief tax collector. He was in charge of all the tax collectors. Well, he was accustomed, obviously, to living very well. He probably enjoyed the sense of authority of the chief tax collector. When he gave orders, people jumped. It was kind of like that E.F. Hutton, commercial we used to have. When E.F. Hutton talks, everybody listens. That's the way it was for Zacchaeus. When he talked, they listened. They better listen. And in his mind, he had somehow erected this elaborate system of rationalizations that helped him live with himself. I can imagine Zacchaeus in his colorful scarlet tunic and his gold embroidered edging. He had all the bling of the Roman wealth. He would kind of rationalize the situation and he'd say, well, somebody has to collect these taxes. If it's not me, someone else is going to do it. Look how well I support my family. They have everything they need. And why shouldn't I live as well as everybody else? And he probably in his mind was saying, you know what, these roads and these aqueducts, they're not going to get built by themselves. I've got to collect the taxes. And yet, in the back of his mind, in the deep resources of his heart, this chief tax collector must have had his doubts. Maybe he felt the shame of the situation more than he would like to admit, because the hate for Zacchaeus was universal. Everybody hated him. Story is told of a mother who was trying to get her son up for school. And she said, come on, you got to get up. You've got to go to school today. And he said, I don't want to go to school today. She said, you got to get up and go to school. I've got your lunch all made for you. You have to get to school. He said, I don't want to go to school. She said, give me 2 reasons why you don't want to go to school. And he says, the teachers hate me and I hate them. And she said, well, I'm going to give you 2 reasons why you have to go to school. Number 1, because you're 58 years old, and number 2, you're the principal. That's why you have to go. Well, people hated Zacchaeus. Maybe it's because of his demanding the taxes. They hated him. Maybe Zacchaeus, in the chapter before, it talks about a tax collector who stood off in the corner and prayed, Lord, be merciful to me, a sinner. And I've often wondered if that was Zacchaeus in just the chapter before in Luke. Well, anyway, Zacchaeus felt the weight of his own sinfulness. And he felt the sin in his life was far more than he even wanted to share with his friends. Why would he be so determined to see Jesus? Can you imagine anything more silly than this kind of short, middle-aged man climbing a tree right in the full view of every person there in town? It's determination. And I can just kind of imagine Zacchaeus kind of peering through the foliage, trying to hide himself, trying to disguise himself up there in the tree. And he was wanting to see Jesus. But after all, he was the chief tax collector. And yet there was a hungering in his life so hard, so much, so intense, that he was willing to take and risk looking foolish to his family, looking foolish to everyone else that saw him, because he wanted to see Jesus. And Zacchaeus is perched up in that tree when finally Jesus comes by. The crowd's pushing, the crowd's shoving from every direction. But Jesus looks up and he sees Zacchaeus hiding in the tree. And he says to Zacchaeus, I want you to come down because I'm going to your house today. Now, as almost in a dream, Zacchaeus unceremoniously begins to slide down that tree. And the shock kind of begins to wear off as he gives way to joy. And he says to himself, Jesus actually called me by name. Jesus is coming to my house today. And he was so excited. I want you to put yourself in Zacchaeus' place. Maybe you're at a party somewhere, and there's some dignitaries there. Maybe there is some president or whatever, and they say to you, and they call you by the name, and they say, Roger Rustad, so good to see you. Hey, I was hoping I could come by after the party and maybe just have a little snack and we could spend some time together. That's what Zacchaeus thought in his mind. Jesus called me by name right in front of all my friends like he knows me. Now, can you imagine? The Bible says that Zacchaeus slid down that tree and he welcomed Jesus with great joy. Jesus has called me by my name in front of all of my friends. This was the greatest moment in Zacchaeus' life. And whenever Jesus comes into the heart, into the life, into the home of an individual, it is their greatest moment. As a chaplain, I've seen thousands of people from every walk of life. And I can tell you that joy that you can see on their face when they make that full surrender. Now, there's another group of people that's not as thrilled to see Zacchaeus having Jesus come into their house. And there's a people out there, the neighbors, and they were not thrilled at all. And they began to take and murmur, and they began to complain, and they grumbled among themselves. And the discontent in the crowd begins to grow very, very quickly. And soon the religious leaders begin to voice their displeasure. And they said, this man has gone to eat at the house of a sinner. Can you believe it? Now, they could not begin to realize what was going on inside of that house that day. Something tremendous was going on, something miraculous, something life-changing, something that Zacchaeus, all his life had been searching for, and now was actually happening. And he found the key to becoming a new person. And we know that in the middle of the meal, that he stood up and he said to the Lord, and obviously Jesus had become his Lord, because it's Lord, listen, half of my belongings I will give to the poor, and if I've wronged anyone, I'm going to give it back 4 times to them. He had found the key to becoming a new person. Jesus said to him, he says, today salvation has come to this house. What an amazing story. Zacchaeus, the chief tax collector, found salvation in his own home. And it's a beautiful story, and it's an enchanting story, and it can be your story, it can be my story as well. Now, I want you to notice 3 things that made this day the most beautiful, significant day in Zacchaeus' life. First of all, Zacchaeus knew he was doing wrong, and that's the very first step. Many people know they're doing wrong, but they won't admit it to themselves. It was in the summer of 1977, maybe some of you remember, New York City had suffered a total blackout. And for about a day or over a day, everything was blacked out. It was just, there was no electricity at all. And so that meant all of the alarm systems, everything was not working. And so there was a rampage of looting that took place. And it was absolutely unbelievable. It was kind of like Rodney King, if you remember back in the 90s here, and the looting that took place. My wife and I and her family, we were back in New York at that time. We thought, we'll just drive down Harlem. We'll go down some of the areas where they did all of this looting. And I can tell you, it looked like a bombed out area. Cars were overturned. Every window in the stores were smashed. It was just unbelievable, glass and garbage all over the place. And I remember listening on one interview on the TV, a news reporter was asking a young person there what it was like when the blackout took place. He said it was like Christmas. He said everybody was looting. He said the old women, the pregnant ladies, everyone was taking stuff. It was just like Christmas. He said they couldn't do anything about it because there were so many people taking things. And yes, he began to rationalize this behavior. At times people do that. It's astonishing. Until we admit, like Zacchaeus, that we're on the wrong path, then there's nothing there's no hope for us. Until we feel the own weight of that sin upon us, we can never cast our burden upon the Lord. There was a great preacher that was asked the question. He says, how much weight does a person have to have before they have to turn to God? How much weight upon them? And he says, well, a corpse can have several tons of weight and never know it. And people who are spiritually dead will never feel the weight of their own sins. And so the more alive you are to God, the more unbearable is any transgressions. Zacchaeus knew he had done wrong, and so he climbed that tree to see Jesus. And the second thing is, I want you to notice in the story how quickly Zacchaeus welcomed Jesus to come to his home as he slid down that tree. The Bible says that he came down and welcomed him with great joy. And you and I may not appreciate the true meaning of what it was of Jesus going to Zacchaeus' home. But anthropologists tell us that when you eat a meal with someone, in many, many cultures, that forges a tie with that individual. And that's why, like in India today, the Brahmas will never eat with the untouchables. They can never do that because it forms a tie with them. And they're very, very careful on their caste system. But you know what? The neighbors are complaining. This man eats with sinners. But you know something? When Jesus is invited into any home by the sinner, he's going to be there. And he's going to be there for them. Well, it's our hope. We're not tax collectors. But yet, by the same token, we maybe don't live up to everything that we need in our lives. And I'm thankful that we serve a God who's willing to come into our homes no matter what. Zacchaeus welcomed Jesus, and someone has noted, we want the religion in our homes. We want all the trappings of a piety and of a religion, but sometimes we don't want Jesus. Or like one person said, Lord, I want you to save me, but don't save me quite yet. Well, Zacchaeus hurried down from his perch in the sycamore tree, and he had been imprisoned by his own misdoings. And now Jesus represented freedom, what he had been looking for. You know, it's interesting sometimes as a chaplain, meeting with people, and I've been by the bedside of hundreds of people when they took their last breath. Many people resist Jesus for the opposite reason, because they look at Jesus as a prison, as someone that's limiting their freedom. And they don't realize that Jesus is freedom personified. That's why Jesus could approach the Samaritan woman there at the well. That's why he could be at the home of Simon Peter, the fisherman. That's why he could be in the court of Caiaphas. And that's why he could eat dinner with Zacchaeus, the chief tax collector. We want that freedom that Jesus brings, but our arteries sometimes are so clogged with anxiety. Our family life is worn away by petty insecurities and resentments. Our nights are being filled with tossing and turning and restlessness. And we need to welcome Jesus into our homes. But there's one more thing. I want you to notice how quickly that Zacchaeus and how completely he made this change in his life. He said, listen, sir, of all my belongings, I'm going to give half to the poor. And if I wronged anyone, I'm going to give them 4 times what I've taken from them. And that's the acid test for salvation. Does it really make a difference in the way we live our lives? Can you walk out of these doors today and say that Jesus has made a difference in our life and made a difference on how we're going to live our life this week? Zacchaeus was ready for a change to take place. And that's why he welcomed Jesus into his home. And as a sign that he had actually accepted Jesus, he made that outward change in his life as well, in the way that he conducted his business. Zacchaeus had to endure all of the scorn, all of the ridicule heaped on him by the scribes and the Pharisees, but it didn't bother him because he had made that decision to follow Jesus. And like Luke 19:19 says, this day salvation has come into this house. Zacchaeus and his entire family benefited from his decision that day. The church suffers for a lack of commitment by many of its members. When I worked as a trauma chaplain, and I just met one of the trauma nurses today that I had worked with at Mission for many years. When you work as a trauma chaplain and you work at a place where you have between 60, 70, 80,000 ER visits and trauma visits in a year, you're going to have a lot of different good experiences, a lot of different stories that you can tell. And I can remember one evening I had a chaplain that had a family emergency, and they asked me if I would take their evening shift for them. And I told them that I would. And so usually on a Saturday night, usually when about 2:30 in the morning, they would have what they call last call for alcohol, just before the bars close. And right after the bars close, the pagers would just go wild, and we'd have so many accidents sometimes. Well, I remember the pager going off a little earlier than normal. The bars had not closed yet. We got called in for a trauma. And I can remember there, as I beat the ambulance to the door, there, as we opened the door of the gurney burst in and the police are there, there was a young man covered with blood, head to toe tattoos, handcuffed to his gurney. And he was spewing out all of these profanities, cursing those who were bringing him in. And they began to tell the story. They said this young man had just gotten out of prison just a couple days before. He'd gotten into a bar fight. And there he had broke a bunch of stuff in the bar, and he was leaving the bar and in a hurry, and he hit several cars on the way out. The police chased him, and he began to take and try to flee, and they had the highway patrol and everyone there. Finally, he got out of the car and was fleeing, and they had to taser him to take and subdue him. And now this young man is being brought in, covered with blood, head to toe tattoos, everything pierced that could be pierced. And the doctors and the staff began to work on him as quick as they could. I remember after the doctors had been working on him for a while, and they would take and ask the chaplain to come up afterwards, and the chaplain would take and get the information for the family to call. And I stepped up to him and I asked him if he had a wife that he'd like for me to call. And he said, no, my wife has a restraining order against me. I can't talk to her. And I said, well, do you have anyone else that I could call? And he says, well, my mother. And I said, well, I'll call her. What's her phone number? And he said, no, it's too late. And I promised her I wouldn't get in any trouble. And he said, in fact, that's a tattoo of my mother on my arm. Well, I looked down, and he must have read my mind, because I looked down and I thought, why would anyone have a naked picture of their mother on their arm? And he said, no, it's the other arm. So I went around to the other side of the gurney. And there I saw a picture of a mother that I thought, you know, this lady has gone through a lot with this young man. Well, he began to tell me how he'd just gotten out of prison. Things were not going well. He'd had a few drinks. He had started to get into some fights, and someone mouthed off to him, and he hit him, and they went downhill from there. And so he said to me, he says, what do you think of my tattoos? Well, I had to be very careful of what I said. And I said, well, that artist was a very, very skillful artist to do that tattoo. I said, that's beautiful artwork. And kind of went on, and I began to explain to him, I said, you got a lot of piercings here, and these piercings have to come out before we do the x-rays. Before you go to CAT scan, these have to come out, because they're going to affect the CAT scan. And I said, what we're going to do is we're going to put these in a plastic bag, and we're going to save these for you. And when you get out, we're going to put them in a safe. You can have them back. Well, he began to grumble and complain. People are always, he says, they always hate my piercings. They're always on me about my ink. And he said, now you don't like my piercings either, do you? And I said, no, your ink doesn't bother me. Your piercings don't bother me one bit. And I said, you may not know this, but body piercings saved my life. And he said, dude, tell me the story. And I said, I can't right now. I said, we're real busy. I'm going to get you down to CAT scan. And so there all the way down, as I was pushing the gurney down, he kept saying, dude, tell me the story. And I said, I will later. And of course, you could smell the alcohol in his breath. Well, the night wore on. And in between traumas, I'd slipped down by his room there. And he kept saying, dude, tell me the story. I said, I will later. I'm really, really busy right now. And so finally, when I had a few minutes, and after the night had been a very, very busy night, I slipped over to his room, and I remember walking past the sheriffs that were there at the door guarding. And something interesting is they never arrest anyone there in the hospital. There's one big reason why they don't do that. Anyone have an idea? They don't arrest anyone. They'll have someone there to make sure that they can't escape. But they don't arrest them, because if they do, then they're responsible for the bill, because they're under their custody. So They're very careful not to arrest him in the hospital because they don't want that bill, and sometimes it can be several $100,000. Well, after he had his stitches and the x-rays, I remember going into his room, and I slipped into his room, and I pulled up a chair and I sat down, and he had been sleeping off the alcohol. His eyes wide open. He says, "Dude, you got to tell me that story." And so I told him that I would sit down and tell him the story. And I began to tell him how body piercing had saved my life. And I began to tell him the story of Jesus and how 2,000 years ago on a Friday, he had saved my life. And as I began to tell him the story, tears began to trickle down his cheeks as he remembered how his mother had raised him, taking him to Sunday school. And he had began to tell me how his life had been so changed because of drugs and because of alcohol. And I began to hand him a box of Kleenex. And he told about how he got involved with gangs and how his life had just gone downhill, how his wife had finally had a restraining order against him, and he wasn't even allowed to see his 2 little boys. Well, they told him how Jesus died for him and how Jesus was pierced for him to save his life. And I tried to tell him how much that Jesus loved him. And regardless of all of the sins that he had done, that Jesus loved him and had a place for him in heaven. He said, "Dude, if they know all the things I've done, they'll never let me out of prison. They'll never let me out." And I told him how our sins were cast to the bottom of the sea. Well, we talked about his broken home. We talked about the restraining orders and the things that needed to be, the changes that need to be made. I shared a couple more scriptures with him. And I left him the copy of that Bible that I had been reading there and gave it to him. And told him that this book has the power to change your life if you'll just let it. Well, we had a quick little prayer. And kind of like Zacchaeus, and in his home, people on the outside could not understand what was going on the inside. It was a spiritual encounter, as we would say. And so within his heart, I could see the tears. He was crying. I reached over and took his hand. And I remember having prayer together that day, and we both had kind of lost track of time. And I remember the sun was just coming through the window, and we said our goodbyes, and I wondered if I would ever see him again. And I turned and I left the door, and I looked back at him, and I said, I said, "John, I don't know if God has a refrigerator or not. But if God has a refrigerator, I'll bet he's got your picture on it." And he just began to cry some more, and he says, "Dude, that's where my mom put my pictures all through school. She put my pictures on the refrigerator." And I said, "Well, if God has a picture, he's got it's on his refrigerator. If God has a refrigerator, your picture's on it." I finally left and walked out the door. And like many of our patients, I never really, get to see them again. Well, years went by. I kind of thought of the story many different times, and it would cross my mind and wonder what had happened. And one day, it was probably 3 years later, my wife had asked me to stop by Home Depot and to pick something up. And I remember going into Home Depot, and I was just going through the checkout line there. And I saw a man in front of me with 2 little boys. He had long sleeves on. He had a collar. I could see above the collar that his tattoos were showing. And he kept looking at me and kept looking at me. And he looked kind of familiar, but I couldn't remember, what. And a lot of times when you have a lot of traumas, people who've been in traumas have come up to me later and they'll say, "Do you remember me?" And I'm like, "Not really." But sometimes it's like 9/11. Where were you on 9/11? Probably most of you could tell you where you were on 9/11. And he said, "Are you a chaplain?" And I said, "Yes." "Do you work at the hospital?" And he named out, "Yes." And he said, "Do you remember talking to me?" And I had to stop and think. I said, "Not right off." And he began to tell me. And he says, "Well, I'll never forget what you told me that day." And he began to tell me the story of how he said, you left the room and you left me the little Bible, and he kept saying, I had to go back to prison because I violated my parole. And he said, you told me as you walked out that day that if God had a refrigerator, my picture would be on it. And you said to me, you told me the story about how a body piercing saved your life. And he said, I remember that story, and for the next several years, he said every time I would take it, and I'd look at my homies, and he said I would see where they had their piercings and they had their tattoos, and I thought, God, Jesus, his piercing saved my life. I'd look in a magazine, I'd pick up a magazine, I'd see a kitchen, I'd see a refrigerator, and I'd think, my picture's on God's refrigerator, and everything preached a sermon to me. And finally, he began to tell the story of how he broke down in complete surrender. And he said, got back with my wife, I was reunited with her, I started going back to church, and he said, I haven't missed a single week since. I've got my 2 sons, and he said, life has never been better. Salvation came to his house, and everyone benefited from it. It's a story of Zacchaeus' life. It's a story that can be our life. We need to come down from our perch in the sycamore tree, and we need to listen to the cries of humanity all around us, because it doesn't matter about our past, because God has the power to make the changes in our lives if we'll let us. Father in heaven, we realize that it's your blood that cleanses us from all sin. We want to welcome you into our house and our houses, into our hearts, into our lives. We want to walk out these doors today of this sanctuary knowing that we've made a complete and full surrender to you, that salvation's come into our hearts, that we have that spiritual peace. May we be able to have that same experience that Zacchaeus had, so others can see the change in our lives, and we can have that peace that passes understanding, that only comes when we make a complete and full surrender to you. We ask these things in your beautiful and precious name. Amen.